One of the wonders of national politics is that a politician can go from being a non-entity on the back benches to running a department without any perceivable competence or knowledge of the subject. We would be horrified if the head of the British Medical Association had no medical expertise. Yet MPs' only raison d'etre is that they can win a seat in Parliament and have the ear of the Prime Minister. One such example was John Stracey, who was appointed the Minister of Food in 1946 by the then Prime Minister Clement Attlee. He was a journalist by profession prior to entering Parliament. Before becoming a minister, he was Under Secretary for the Air Force. To be fair, he did serve in the RAF during the war, largely in a public relations capacity. This is the story of the flagrant waste of taxpayers' money over several years on an ill-conceived scheme. Here is the account of the Groundnuts Scandal. Britain at the time was in dire straits. The renowned economist John Maynard Keynes described Britain's plight as a financial Dunkirk. It needed US loans to prevent an economic catastrophe. The country had been sustained by Lend-Lease during the war and was horrified to find out that the Americans, not surprisingly, were not going to be prepared to be so generous in peacetime. At the time, the new socialist government of Clement Attlee was intent on forging a new Jerusalem with the advent of the National Health Service, the revival of the Olympic Games in London, and a Festival of Britain which was to rival the Great Exhibition of the 1850s. Despite the loss of the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, India, the country could use, or more accurately exploit, parts of the remaining colonial lands to its own advantage, especially in parts of Africa. Britain was still subject to rationing, and this state of affairs would last until 1954. John Stracey's first move was to introduce bread rationing, which did not endear him to the long-suffering British public. There was a huge outcry from the Conservative opposition, the press, and a group called the British Housewives' League. During the war there was no bread rationing, though the bakers were forced to use what was called a national loaf, so unpopular that it was termed Hitler's secret weapon. In the first year of peace, the ravenous public were in no mood for further sacrifices if they could be avoided. After 2 years, bread rationing was dropped. So how was Stracey going to rectify this rather touchy situation? By chance, help was at hand. The multinational conglomerate Unilever was responsible for selling around 2/3 of margarine in Europe. But where was it going to get all the ingredients that were necessary to cater for endless demand? At the time, a man called Frank Samuel at the United Africa Company, which was a subsidiary of Unilever, happened to be flying over Africa and noted that there were vast tracts of land. It was in Tanganyika, later to be called Tanzania, that was what he thought essentially as wilderness. Why not clear the bush and cultivate groundnuts there, on land that was free to grab? This time, rather than relying on native labour by selling them the seeds and fertiliser and merely buying the crop, a radical alternative was proposed: the use of centralised socialist planning that relied on mechanisation on a vast scale, using the latest scientific techniques. John Stracey was a former communist and a firm believer in the concept of centralised state planning. It was all music to his ears. It was a dream come true. He could increase the rations for the hungry British public, sell the surplus to the rest of the world, and even use the shells as a fibre product. So what exactly is this wondrous groundnut? It is known today the world over by the more familiar name of the peanut. It is an annual plant rich in protein, can be made into flour, produces a fine oil, It's the largest source of vegetable oil globally and can be made into many nutritious products, such as the ever-popular peanut butter. Originally heralding from South America, it is widely grown today across the world in temperate climates. The husk or shell can be made into industrial products, such as plastics and paper, and the nuts themselves are used in many commercial applications. A member of the legume family of plants, the nuts grow from the roots under the soil, and even the leaves and stalks can be used for animal fodder or composted down for fertilizer. On the 20th of July, 1946, a party was sent to Tanganyika to explore this idea. It consisted of A.J. Wakefield, an old Africa hand and former Director of Agriculture for the Tanganyika Territory, J.N. Ross of the Colonial Office, and D.L. Martin of the United Africa Company. They started their report towards the end of July and submitted it at the end of September. Its findings were spectacular and ambitious. It advocated that the scheme would involve 107 units of 30,000 acres each, of which 80 units would be in Tanganyika, 17 in northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, and 10 in Kenya. The goal was a production of 800,000 tons of groundnuts per year by 1951. It was expected to cost £25 million and be profitable within 2 years. The scheme was expected to eat up the equivalent land area of Connecticut or Yorkshire. It was nothing but a grand plan, if it could be made to work. There was no pilot scheme, and there was insufficient local information, ranging from the local weather conditions to accurate maps. The report was later described in Parliament as a prospectus, rather than a neutral study on the subject. To demonstrate the feasibility of the scheme, mechanisation had been shown to work in the United States, but the size of the plots were between 1 and 2 acres. Anyway, it was assumed that following this route would overcome Mother Nature and that there was no need for a pilot project. 3 main centres were chosen. In Tanganyika it was Kongwa, in the central province Urambo to the west, as well as to what was called the southern province. This scheme involved the construction of railway lines, roads, and a deep-water port. It was intended to be a catalyst to open up and develop other parts of East Africa. After a 3-month mission, the team's report in September 1946 was optimistically favourable to the scheme and recommended the cultivation of 3.21 million acres for groundnuts by 1952. The Cabinet approved the recommendations in January 1947 and began transporting personnel and machinery to Tanganyika. Officials began to recruit men for the Groundnut Army, and 100,000 former soldiers volunteered for the 1,200 jobs. Kongwa was chosen as the first site, and it was also selected as the local headquarters for the whole project. One of the key reasons was that it was sparsely populated and therefore easily acquired. In 1943, the Kenyan government was able to clear 3,000 acres of forest and bush, so why not here as a place to start? But Kongwa had one serious problem. It was covered with thick, thorny, deciduous trees, such as acacia and baobabs, which would prove extremely difficult to clear. At the beginning, the United African Company was given the contract, beloved of all firms dealing with any post-war government. They were not given a fixed budget, but negotiated a cost-plus contract. Within a year, the contract was handed over to the Overseas Food Corporation. The official reason was that a commercial enterprise would have difficulty securing machinery in the current climate of overall supply chain shortages. In 1948, the Overseas Food Corporation came into existence, following the creation of the Overseas Resources Act. There was also another quango, called the Colonial Development Corporation. The OFC was attached to the Ministry of Food, and its main aim was to promote the Groundnuts scheme. It was allowed to borrow up to a maximum of £50 million, and £5 million on a temporary basis. You can gauge the importance of the Act by its sponsorship. It included the Minister of Food, the Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Minister of Economic Affairs, and the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations. Literally, the government was betting the house on this scheme. Who was to run the Overseas Food Corporation? Instead of appointing an experienced Africa expert or agronomist, John Stracey appointed a Daily Express executive called Dick Plummer, who would later become a Labour MP, an advocate of improved racial relations. He did not seem to have any experience of running such a vast enterprise, no tangible knowledge of Africa, and was not an agronomist. Supposedly headquartered in Kongwa, the real decisions were being made in London. What could possibly go wrong? Let's take a closer look for a moment at Tanganyika, or Tanzania as it was later to become. It is the 13th largest African country, between Egypt and Nigeria. It comprises 365,000 square miles, which 2 Californias would fit into. To the north it is mountainous and forested, and Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest point in Africa. It is no wonder that the project called for a new port, railway system, and reliable roads. The advance party set up camp in Kongwa, not far from Dodoma, now the capital of Tanzania, and scouted out the area. They deemed it suitable for groundnuts despite the large amount of clay and the local shortage of water, and established the scheme's headquarters there. Gradually a whole town was established. Obtaining the heavy equipment necessary to clear the land for cultivation, however, proved difficult. Eventually the project managers found some suitable tractors and bulldozers from Canada and bought up US Army surplus tractors from the Philippines, though many proved to be too rusted to use. This then had to be transported through the port of Dar es Salaam, which became hopelessly congested, to the inland site using the only available transport, a single-track railway with steam locomotives. A sudden flood of the Kinyansungwe River wiped out part of the rail tracks, leaving a dirt road as the only means of transport. This delayed the arrival of the bulldozers needed for clearing until April 1947. Even then, the bush proved far harder to clear than the planners had expected. Besides the natural hazards of local wildlife, on several occasions workers had to face angry elephants and rhinoceros. They found the large local baobab trees were hard to remove, a task made more difficult by one of them being a local tribal jail, another a site of ancestor worship, and many had bees' nests in their hollow trunks. Several workers were hospitalized with vicious bee stings, but the main casualties were the heavy machines. By the end of the summer of 1947, 2/3 of the imported tractors had been rendered unusable. Bulldozer blades that were used to extract ground roots were ruined in a couple of days. In the spirit of making do, the scheme brought up surplus Sherman tanks and got the Vickers Engineering Company to take the armour off and put a bulldozer blade on the front, creating what was known as Shervicks. But these too proved no match for the African bush. Eventually, in the wooded southern province, they discovered that a long chain linked between 2 bulldozers would flatten all the trees in between, while a third bulldozer was used to overturn any trees that resisted the chain. The first order for a suitable ship's anchor chain from London was, however, stopped, as it was felt to be a mistake. This showed the real folly of centralised planning. In September, the African workers joined a nationwide strike for 3 days. The expatriate staff were less than delighted, as they had to do their own cooking. A growing number of Africans were then employed as tractor drivers and, after early errors, became skilled at the job. With great difficulty, the Groundnut Army was finally able to plant the first nuts. When the rainy season arrived, some of the workshops and stores were swept away by flash floods. After that, the hot season baked the ground clay into a hard surface that made harvesting the nuts very difficult. The first year's planting was not a success, as only 9,000 acres went for cultivation against an original target of 150,000 acres. There were a number of factors at play. The planting of peanuts should have occurred between the rainy season, between the 1st of May and 31st of October, not at the turn of the year. The port at Dar es Salaam was hopelessly overcrowded, and there was a shortage of skilled African workers through inadequate training. But there were other factors such as a shortage of fuel from Britain and unfavourable weather conditions at sea. The first problem was transport. The nearest port to Kongwa was 240 kilometres away. Dar es Salaam was an old port and hopelessly overcrowded. In 1948 it handled 400,000 tonnes of freight traffic, and within a year this had risen to over 500,000 tonnes, of which 65,000 tonnes related to the Groundnuts scheme. Committees were formed in both Tanganyika and London to regulate this traffic, but the port had various treaty obligations to perform. For instance, it had an agreement to accept freight from the Belgian Congo, irrespective of the wishes of the OFC. There were plans to use Mombasa in Kenya and a new port down south, but effectively these were of no practical use to the scheme. Tanganyika was, and still is, served by one main railway line from Dar es Salaam up to Lake Tanganyika to the east. There were a number of branch lines, but the scheme needed one to be built connecting Kongwa to the main line, which was only 40 kilometres away. Otherwise, it was a gruelling round trip on dusty roads to and from the coast, which would be impossible in the rainy season. The line was built, but was soon washed away in a flash flood. Air travel, though growing rapidly after the war, was of no use in transporting heavy machinery to the desired area. All the machinery had to be imported and then brought up country, either by a single-track rail line or by dusty roads that were little more than tracks and impassable in the rainy season. You can understand the frustrations of the OFC board. The scheme soon ran into trouble. The tractors were intended for earth moving and construction, not tree felling. For getting rid of the roots, a Latorno road ripper drawn by a tractor was ordered to aid the mechanisation of the project. But the road ripper filled up with roots and proved useless. Back to digging them up by hand. The tractors soon needed spares, and these had to be shipped from abroad. Given the problems at Dar es Salaam and the chronic lack of foreign exchange, the OFC turned to British suppliers. On the ground, tree roots were not the only problem. The African drivers would sometimes drive their tractors to some spot, get drunk, and then be unable to find them again. By 1949, only 81,000 acres had been cleared in Kongwa. Unfortunately, there was a severe drought in that area. The soil consisted of clay, which turned into the consistency of concrete, which proved problematic when planting and harvesting groundnuts. It was decided instead to concentrate on Urumbu and the southern province. By 1950, only 65,000 acres had been cleared in Urumbu and 6,000 in the southern province. But as they say, lessons had been learnt. In 1949, the scheme was in real trouble, and Wakefield and Plummer, who were both on the board of the Overseas Food Corporation, started to blame each other. Stracey had to choose between the two and sacked Wakefield and kept on Plummer. In addition, for good measure, Ross of the Foreign Office, another OFC director and a member of the original Advance Party, was also sacked. But even further down the political and government food chain, loyalty to the cause outstripped any notion of balance. You had to believe in the scheme if you wanted to survive the corporate jungle. Dr. Bunting, a famous botanist, remembers taking soil samples whilst the land was being cleared. He criticised the scheme and was told he would never work on government projects again. With some difficulty, he obtained a post with the Anglo-Egyptian government in Sudan. The whole thing was attracting bad publicity in Parliament from 1949 onwards. Sunflowers were introduced to the Kongwa district, but they were destroyed in the drought of 1949. Clement Attlee was forced to replace Stracey with Maurice Webb. Ironically, he was a former journalist before becoming an MP, this time with the Daily Herald rather than the Daily Express. Then it was revealed that the cost of growing peanuts was 6 times the eventual sale price. The scheme had risen in cost to the long-suffering taxpayer to £36.5 million, the equivalent of well over £1 billion in today's money. Given the cost overruns we see daily in government, the sum of £36.5 million seems trivial. But this ignores the economically perilous position of Britain in those days. Lend-Lease had been abolished just after the war, and the government was forced to take out loans with the Americans just to survive. The whole plan had to buy equipment from the USA, Canada, Belgium and Egypt. All had to be paid in precious dollars, up front. The United Kingdom was horribly overstretched, as it had just launched a universal healthcare system, a secret nuclear bomb program, and was about to do its bit in the Korean War. Something had to give, and so the Tanganyika project was dropped. Kongwa, at the height of the scheme, boasted a town of over 10,000 and was called Half London, as it seemed to everyone from the metropolis had located there. Today it is reverted back to the bush. By late 1949, the scheme was coming in for robust criticism in Parliament and the press. The Labour government persevered, but suffered for it at the election in 1950, and even more when they lost the 1951 general election. In January, they finally cancelled the project, the Treasury writing off a total of over £1 billion. Mechanised production was stopped, and the cleared land handed over to the African farmers, who did a better job growing tobacco, cashew nuts, and herding cattle. Would it have all worked out? The Conservatives did use this scheme to hammer the Socialists, but capitalism also has its fair share of failures, from Henry Ford's ill-conceived attempt to harvest rubber in the Amazon in the 1920s, to the reclusive shipowner Ludwig, who attempted in the 1960s to develop a paper pulp industry, again in the Amazon. It is obvious that Kongwa was the wrong choice, and that the southern province should have been chosen. But the government was desperate, and as we all know, desperate men are not the most reliable types to make good decisions. Just because there's an overwhelming demand for some product does not mean that you can ignore local conditions. No point listening to the natives. After all, they only live there and know what will grow and what will not.